August 1943. Two generals are literally racing each other across a burning island while Germans are shooting at both of them. Not to defeat the enemy first. No, no, no. They are racing to humiliate each other. And when the American general wins this insane competition, Winston Churchill said something so savage, so brutally honest, that historians tried to bury it for decades. What did he say? And why did it almost break the entire Allied alliance apart? Look, before I tell you what Churchill said, you need to understand what was actually happening in Sicily in the summer of 1943. Because this wasn't just a battle. This was a clash of egos so massive, so ridiculously petty, that it makes modern celebrity beefs look like kindergarten arguments. We're talking about two of the most famous generals of World War II, George S. Patton and Bernard Montgomery, literally turning a military campaign into a personal grudge match. And the crazy part? Their commanders knew about it. Their governments knew about it. And nobody stopped them because, honestly, everyone was kind of enjoying watching these two alpha males try to destroy each other. Let me set the scene properly. By mid-1943, the Allies had finally kicked the Germans and Italians out of North Africa. It took them almost 3 years, countless battles, and way more casualties than anyone had planned for. But they did it. Now they had a problem. A big problem. What do we do next? The Americans, led by General George Marshall and backed by President Roosevelt, wanted to go straight for the throat. Cross the English Channel, land in France, march to Berlin, and end this war as fast as possible. Makes sense, right? Shortest distance between 2 points and all that. But the British had a completely different idea. And this is where you start to understand why Churchill said what he said about Patton. Winston Churchill was obsessed with the Mediterranean. And I mean obsessed. The man had nightmares about it. See, Churchill remembered World War I. He remembered a little disaster called Gallipoli, where he personally championed an invasion of Turkey through the Dardanelles Strait. That invasion failed catastrophically. Thousands of soldiers died. Churchill's political career was nearly destroyed. He had to resign from the government and actually went to fight in the trenches himself to rebuild his reputation. So when World War II came around, Churchill saw the Mediterranean as his chance at redemption. He called it the soft underbelly of Europe. His idea was simple. Instead of attacking Hitler's fortress directly through France, where the Germans were strongest, why not sneak in through the back door? Take Italy, move up through the Balkans, and squeeze Germany from the south while the Soviets pressed from the east. The Americans thought this was insane. They thought Churchill was trying to rebuild the British Empire under the cover of fighting Hitler. They thought the Mediterranean strategy was a waste of time, resources, and American lives. But here's the thing about coalitions in wartime, you have to keep your allies happy. The British had been fighting this war since 1939. The Americans only showed up after Pearl Harbor in late 1941. The British had experience. They had intelligence networks. They had skin in the game. And frankly, in 1943, they still had more troops in the field than the Americans did. So when Churchill pushed for an invasion of Sicily as the next step after North Africa, the Americans reluctantly agreed. Now here's where it gets interesting. The invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, was supposed to be a simple operation. Take the island, knock Italy out of the war, and prove to Stalin that the Western Allies were serious about opening a second front in Europe. The Soviets had been begging for help for 2 years while they bled against the German army on the Eastern Front. Sicily was supposed to be quick, clean, and professional. Instead, it became the most dysfunctional Allied operation of the entire war. And the dysfunction started at the very top, with the two men chosen to lead the ground forces. General Bernard Law Montgomery was, and I cannot stress this enough, one of the most insufferable human beings to ever wear a military uniform. Now look, before the British viewers come for me, let me be clear, Montgomery was a genuinely brilliant general. His victory at El Alamein in October 1942 was the first major defeat the Germans suffered at British hands in the entire war. It saved Egypt, protected the Suez Canal, and turned Montgomery into a national hero overnight. Churchill called him the man who reversed the tide of war. And Montgomery believed every word of it. He believed it so hard that he became completely impossible to work with. Montgomery had this way of looking at other generals like they were slightly dim children who needed his patient guidance. He would explain his plans slowly, using simple words, as if everyone else in the room had never seen a map before. He was condescending in a specifically British way that made Americans want to punch walls. He constantly criticized his colleagues, questioned their competence in private conversations that always somehow leaked to the press, and operated as if he was the only person in the entire Allied command structure who understood how to fight a war. And the worst part? He was often right. Which made everyone hate him even more. Now let's talk about George Smith Patton Jr. If Montgomery was an annoying genius, Patton was a psychotic one. This man was born into wealth, raised with an obsession for military glory, and spent his entire life preparing for exactly this moment. Patton believed he had been a warrior in past lives. He literally believed in reincarnation and thought he had fought as a Roman legionary, a knight in the Crusades, and a soldier in Napoleon's army. He wrote poetry about it. He talked about it openly. His staff thought he was at least partially crazy, and they were probably right. But Patton had something that Montgomery lacked. Speed. Aggression. An almost supernatural ability to keep an army moving forward when every logical factor said it should stop. Where Montgomery planned every detail and refused to advance until everything was perfect, Patton operated on pure violent instinct. He would punch through enemy lines before they even knew he was coming. He would push his tanks until they literally ran out of fuel, then scream at his supply officers until they found more fuel, then push forward again. His men both loved and feared him. He gave incredible speeches that made soldiers feel like immortal warriors. He also slapped soldiers with combat fatigue and called them cowards. Patton was a monster and a hero rolled into one complicated package. So now you have to picture what happened when these two men were put on the same island with the same objective. The plan for Sicily was straightforward on paper. Montgomery's British Eighth Army would land on the eastern side of the island, near Syracuse, and drive north along the coast toward Messina. Messina was the prize. It was the closest point to mainland Italy, connected by a narrow strait just a few miles wide. Whoever controlled Messina controlled whether the German forces could escape to Italy or whether they would be trapped and destroyed on the island. The entire strategic value of the Sicily campaign depended on reaching Messina before the Germans could evacuate. Patton's American Seventh Army was given a supporting role. They would land on the southern coast, protect Montgomery's left flank, and basically act as a shield while the British forces did the real work of taking Messina. This was the plan. And this plan told you everything you needed to know about how the British High Command viewed American soldiers in 1943. See, the British didn't really trust the Americans yet. And you have to understand their perspective. American forces had fought their first major battle against the Germans just a few months earlier, at a place called Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. It was a disaster. The Germans attacked with experienced panzer divisions. The American forces, green and poorly led, collapsed. They retreated in chaos. They abandoned equipment. Over 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in just a few days. It was humiliating. And the British, who had been fighting the Germans for 3 years at this point, took note. Montgomery in particular looked at Kasserine Pass and concluded that Americans couldn't fight. He didn't say this publicly, of course. That would have been diplomatically unwise. But in private conversations, in letters to his colleagues, and in his general attitude during planning meetings, Montgomery made it absolutely clear that he considered American forces to be amateurs who needed to be kept away from anything important. The Sicily plan reflected this attitude perfectly. Montgomery would take Messina. Patton would watch his flank. The Americans would learn from their betters. You can imagine how George Patton felt about this arrangement. Here was a man who had spent his entire life preparing for glory. A man who believed he was the reincarnation of ancient warriors. A man with an ego roughly the size of Texas. And he was being told to sit in the corner while some British general with a beret and a smug expression won all the glory. Patton didn't just disagree with this plan. He was physically enraged by it. He wrote in his diary that he would find a way to beat Montgomery to Messina even if he had to go through the entire German army to do it. This wasn't just professional competition anymore. This was personal. And it was about to get ugly. The invasion began on July 10, 1943. It was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. Over 150,000 troops landed on Sicily's beaches in a single night. The airborne operations that preceded the landings were a disaster. High winds scattered paratroopers all over the island. Some landed in the ocean and drowned. Others came down miles from their objectives. Friendly fire incidents killed hundreds of American paratroopers when Allied ships mistook transport planes for enemy aircraft and opened fire. It was chaotic. It was bloody. And it was just the beginning. On the beaches, the story was different. Italian coastal defenses crumbled almost immediately. The Italian soldiers, demoralized after years of defeats and poorly supplied by their government, had no interest in dying for Mussolini's failed dream of empire. Many surrendered at the first opportunity. Some actively helped the Allied forces find their way inland. The real resistance would come from the Germans, who had sent reinforcements to Sicily and had no intention of letting the Allies take the island easily. Within the first few days, the Allied beachheads were secure and forces were moving inland. And this is where the problems started. Montgomery's 8th Army, advancing up the eastern coast toward Messina, ran into serious resistance. The Germans had fortified the area around Mount Etna, the massive volcano that dominates eastern Sicily. The terrain was perfect for defense. Narrow roads, steep hills, countless positions where a handful of defenders could hold up an entire division. Montgomery's advance slowed to a crawl. Now, in any normal military operation, this would be the moment for flexibility. The plan isn't working on the eastern coast? Fine, shift resources to where progress is being made. But Montgomery wasn't interested in normal military operations. Montgomery was interested in Montgomery. He demanded that the overall commander, General Harold Alexander, change the plan to give him control of more roads for his advance. Specifically, he wanted a road that had been assigned to Patton's forces. Alexander, who was British and generally supported Montgomery's approach, agreed. Patton was not informed about this change through proper channels. He found out when one of his divisions was suddenly told to stop advancing and clear out of the way for British forces. This was more than an insult. This was proof, in Patton's mind, that the British considered American forces to be second-class soldiers who could be pushed around at will. He was furious. His staff reported that he was literally red in the face, pacing his headquarters like a caged animal, ranting about British arrogance and demanding to know why American blood was being spilled to support Montgomery's ego. And this is where Patton made his decision. If the High Command wouldn't give him a road to Messina, he would find his own road. If the plan said he should protect Montgomery's flank, he would protect that flank so aggressively that he would end up in Messina before Montgomery ever got there. Patton wasn't going to follow orders. He was going to creatively reinterpret them in a way that would humiliate every British general on the island. What followed was one of the most remarkable campaigns of the entire Second World War. And it would lead directly to Winston Churchill saying something that revealed the true nature of the Anglo-American alliance. The western half of Sicily was technically supposed to be a backwater. Patton's job was to secure it quickly, protect Montgomery's flank, and then wait for further instructions. But Patton saw an opportunity that nobody else seemed to notice. The western half of the island was defended primarily by Italian forces. And by July 1943, Italian forces were not exactly eager to fight and die. Their country was falling apart. Mussolini's government was tottering. Soldiers knew that the war was lost. All they needed was an excuse to surrender. Patton gave them that excuse at approximately 90 miles per hour. He unleashed his armored forces in a sweeping drive across western Sicily that covered more ground in less time than any military operation in the Mediterranean theater. While Montgomery was grinding forward at a few miles per day against German resistance, Patton was conquering entire provinces overnight. His forces captured Palermo, the largest city in Sicily, on July 22, just 12 days after the invasion began. The Italian garrison surrendered almost immediately. Patton's troops captured thousands of prisoners, mountains of equipment, and most importantly, glory. But Patton wasn't satisfied with Palermo. Palermo was in the west. Messina was in the east. And Montgomery was still grinding toward Messina, still bogged down in the mountains around Mount Etna, still insisting that his deliberate approach was the right way to fight a campaign. Patton looked at the map and saw something that made him smile. The northern coast of Sicily. A road that ran from Palermo all the way to Messina, hugging the Mediterranean coast. Nobody had assigned this road to anyone. It was outside the original plan. It was technically outside Patton's area of responsibility. But it was open. And Patton was going to take it. What followed was the famous race to Messina. And I use the word race deliberately because that's exactly what it was. This was no longer about defeating the Germans or liberating Sicily or winning World War II. This was about two egos, two generals, two nations proving which one was superior. The actual strategic objective, which was to trap the German forces on the island and prevent their evacuation, was almost forgotten. Both Montgomery and Patton were so focused on reaching Messina first that they gave the Germans exactly what they needed: time. The Germans, commanded by General Hans Valentin Hube, recognized exactly what was happening. They saw that the Allied generals were more interested in competing with each other than in coordinating their attacks. They saw that Montgomery was obsessed with his slow, methodical advance while Patton was obsessed with speed and glory. And they exploited this dysfunction perfectly. While the Allies raced toward Messina, Hube organized one of the most successful evacuations of the entire war. German forces conducted fighting withdrawals, giving ground slowly while maintaining perfect order. Engineers prepared demolitions. Transport units organized ferries across the Strait of Messina. Over the course of the first 2 weeks of August, while Patton and Montgomery raced toward Messina like children running toward a Christmas tree, the Germans calmly evacuated over 100,000 soldiers, 10,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of equipment to mainland Italy. These were veteran troops. Experienced soldiers who would go on to fight the Allies in Italy for 2 more years. They escaped because 2 generals couldn't stop competing long enough to do their actual jobs. Patton's advance up the northern coast was spectacular and brutal in equal measure. The road to Messina ran through mountains, with countless positions where a few defenders could hold up an entire army. The Germans took advantage of every one of these positions, fighting rearguard actions that slowed Patton's advance to a frustrating crawl. Every time Patton's forces cleared one defensive position, they would find the road ahead blocked by demolitions, with another German position waiting on the next ridge. It was the same problem Montgomery was facing on the eastern coast, just compressed into a narrower front. But Patton had a solution that Montgomery didn't have: the United States Navy. Patton organized a series of amphibious operations, small-scale landings behind German lines that would cut off their retreat and trap them against his advancing ground forces. It was a brilliant concept. It used American naval superiority to bypass German defenses entirely. And it mostly failed, because Patton was too impatient to let these operations develop properly. The first amphibious operation, near the town of Sant'Agata, landed troops behind German lines on August 8. The troops landed in the wrong place, encountered unexpected resistance, and had to be rescued by Patton's ground forces instead of trapping the Germans as planned. A second operation near Brolo on August 11 went better but still failed to cut off significant German forces. By the time Patton's troops reached the next German defensive line, the Germans had already retreated to new positions closer to Messina. Meanwhile, Montgomery's advance on the eastern coast finally started making progress. The Germans, focused on their evacuation, began pulling back their forces from the Mount Etna positions. Montgomery's troops pushed forward, taking town after town, moving closer to Messina with each passing day. The race was genuinely competitive now. Both generals were within striking distance of the prize. Both knew that whoever reached Messina first would be able to claim victory in Sicily. Both were pushing their exhausted troops to the absolute limit. And here's where the pettiness reached its absolute peak. Both Patton and Montgomery started manipulating their intelligence reports to make it look like they were closer to Messina than they actually were. Both started setting up elaborate plans for triumphal entries into the city, complete with photographers and press releases. Both instructed their forward units to make one final push, regardless of casualties, to reach Messina before the other. The actual enemy, the Germans they were supposed to be destroying, was almost an afterthought. The final days of the race to Messina were absolutely insane. Both armies were exhausted. Both had been fighting for over a month in the brutal Sicilian summer heat. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Dust covered everything. Water was scarce. Soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion. And still their generals pushed them forward, demanding more speed, more aggression, more sacrifice. Not to defeat the Germans, mind you. The Germans were already leaving. This was purely about pride. On August 15, 1943, Patton received intelligence that made his heart race. The Germans were accelerating their evacuation. Messina would be empty within days, maybe hours. If he didn't move now, Montgomery might beat him there. Patton immediately ordered his lead elements to push forward at maximum speed. He personally drove to the front lines, screaming at officers, demanding explanations for every delay, threatening careers if his troops weren't in Messina by morning. His staff had never seen him so agitated. This wasn't a military operation anymore. This was an obsession. Montgomery, on the eastern coast, received similar intelligence. He too ordered his forces to accelerate. British troops pushed through the night, clearing German rear guards, bypassing demolished roads, doing everything possible to reach Messina first. Montgomery even sent a message to his corps commander saying that the Americans must not be allowed to claim Messina. Must not be allowed. As if the Americans were the enemy instead of allies fighting the same war. The absurdity of this situation was not lost on everyone. General Omar Bradley, who commanded a corps under Patton, later wrote that the race to Messina was one of the most disgraceful episodes of the entire war. He watched Patton sacrifice men for nothing but personal glory. He watched the strategic objective of the campaign, trapping the German forces, slip away while two generals played games. Bradley never forgave Patton for it. Their relationship, already tense, became actively hostile. And Bradley would remember this moment years later, when he had the power to sideline Patton during crucial moments of the war in Europe. But on August 16, 1943, none of that mattered. What mattered was that American troops from the 3rd Infantry Division entered the outskirts of Messina just after dawn. They encountered almost no resistance. The Germans had completed their evacuation during the night. The last ferry had crossed the Strait to Italy carrying the final German rearguard units. Messina was empty. It was a hollow victory, but it was a victory. And it was American. Patton arrived in Messina a few hours later, staging the kind of triumphal entry that he had been planning for weeks. He rode into the city in a command car, flags flying, photographers snapping pictures, reporters scribbling notes. He was beaming. He had done it. He had beaten Montgomery. He had proven that American soldiers could outfight, outmaneuver, and outrun their British allies. This was the moment he had dreamed about since childhood. The moment when George S. Patton took his rightful place among the great captains of history. But even in his moment of triumph, Patton couldn't resist one more act of pettiness. When a British patrol entered Messina from the eastern approach shortly after Patton's arrival, Patton made a point of greeting them personally. He wanted Montgomery's men to see him standing in the city center, already victorious. He wanted them to report back to their commander that the Americans had won. According to witnesses, Patton shook hands with the British officers, smiled broadly, and said something like "Welcome to Messina, glad you could make it." The British officers were not amused. Montgomery received the news of Patton's victory with characteristic grace, which is to say no grace at all. He immediately began making excuses. The terrain on his route was more difficult. The German resistance was stronger on his front. The American sector had been easier from the beginning. Montgomery never acknowledged that Patton had outgeneraled him. He never admitted that his slow, methodical approach had given the Germans time to escape. Instead, he blamed everyone and everything except himself. His staff. His superiors. The weather. The Italians. The Americans. Anyone but Bernard Law Montgomery. The recriminations began almost immediately. American commanders, led by Patton but including many others, argued that the Sicily campaign had proven American forces were equal to or better than British forces. They demanded equal status in future planning. They demanded American commanders for American troops. They demanded an end to the British assumption that they knew better how to fight this war. The British pushed back hard. They pointed out that the American victory in western Sicily had been against Italian forces, not Germans. They argued that Montgomery's methodical approach was actually correct, even if it was slower. They suggested that Patton's recklessness had endangered the entire operation and that his glory hunting had allowed the German army to escape. Both sides had valid points. Both sides also had massive blind spots. And both sides were so focused on their argument that they missed the larger picture. The Sicily campaign had been a strategic failure. Yes, the Allies had captured the island. Yes, Italy would soon surrender. But the German army had escaped intact. Over 100,000 veteran soldiers, plus their equipment, were now in Italy preparing defensive positions that would cost the Allies dearly in the months and years ahead. The race to Messina had accomplished nothing except to save German lives and cost Allied ones. Now here's where Winston Churchill enters the story. And to understand what Churchill said about Patton's victory, you need to understand the impossible position Churchill was in during the summer of 1943. Churchill was fighting multiple wars simultaneously. He was fighting the Germans, obviously. But he was also fighting the Americans for control of Allied strategy. And he was fighting his own generals for control of British forces. Churchill wanted the Mediterranean strategy to succeed. He had staked his reputation on it. The invasion of Sicily was supposed to prove that attacking through the soft underbelly of Europe was the right approach. It was supposed to justify delaying the cross-channel invasion that the Americans wanted. It was supposed to show that British strategic thinking was superior to American impatience. Instead, Sicily had proven exactly the opposite. The campaign had been marked by dysfunction, rivalry, and strategic failure. The Germans had escaped. The Italians had surrendered, but that was happening anyway as Mussolini's government collapsed. And most damagingly, an American general had humiliated the British army by winning a race that the British were supposed to win easily. Churchill received the news of Patton's victory while he was at the Quebec Conference, meeting with President Roosevelt to plan the next phase of the war. This was supposed to be Churchill's moment of triumph. He was supposed to arrive at Quebec with news of a great British victory in Sicily, proof that his Mediterranean strategy was working. Instead, he arrived with news that an American general had beaten the famous Montgomery in a race that had let the German army escape. The American delegation at Quebec was not subtle about their satisfaction. They viewed Patton's victory as proof that American forces were ready to take the lead in the European war. They pushed hard for the cross-channel invasion, arguing that Sicily had shown the limits of the Mediterranean approach. They suggested that perhaps American generals should command future operations, since American generals seemed to get results faster than British ones. Churchill was furious. Not at Patton specifically, but at the entire situation. His strategy had been undermined. His favorite general had been embarrassed. His negotiating position at Quebec had been weakened. And now he had to sit across the table from smiling American officials who were using Patton's victory as ammunition against everything Churchill had worked for. This is the context in which Churchill made his famous statement about Patton and Messina. And here's the thing, Churchill didn't make just one statement. He made several, at different times, to different audiences. Some were recorded in official documents. Others were overheard by aides and reported later. Some may have been embellished over time. But the essence of what Churchill said has been preserved, and it reveals everything about how the British establishment viewed their American allies. The most famous version of Churchill's statement came during a private conversation with his military advisers shortly after the Quebec Conference. According to multiple sources who were present, Churchill said something to the effect of, "The Americans have won the race to Messina." How unfortunate that there was no one there to meet them. This statement is devastating in its understatement. On the surface, it's simply an observation that Messina was empty when the Americans arrived. But the implication is clear: Patton won a race to capture a city that didn't matter because the Germans had already left. The American victory was hollow. The American sacrifice was pointless. The American general was a fool who had been outsmarted by the Germans while he was busy outsmarting the British. Churchill's statement also contains a subtle dig at the American obsession with speed and glory over strategic thinking. The Americans rushed to Messina. The British took their time. And in the end, neither approach mattered because the Germans had already won by escaping. Churchill was suggesting that the entire Sicily campaign had been a waste, but if anyone was to blame, it was the Americans for turning it into a race instead of a coordinated military operation. But Churchill wasn't finished. In other conversations around the same time, he made additional comments that were even more revealing. He reportedly said that Patton was a magnificent fighter who unfortunately thought he was fighting the British instead of the Germans. He said that the American army was like a young boxer, full of energy and aggression, but lacking the wisdom to know when to fight and when to wait. He said that the race to Messina had cost the Allies a chance to destroy the German army in Sicily, and that this failure would haunt them for years. All of these statements were technically accurate. The race to Messina had been strategically pointless. Patton had been more focused on beating Montgomery than on trapping the Germans. The American army was young and inexperienced compared to the British. But Churchill's statements also revealed something darker: a deep British resentment of American power and a desperate need to maintain the illusion that Britain was still the senior partner in the alliance. See, by 1943, it was becoming increasingly clear that America was the dominant partner in the Anglo-American alliance. The United States had more men, more money, more industrial capacity, and more political will to fight this war to the finish. Britain was exhausted after 4 years of war. Its empire was crumbling. Its economy was dependent on American support. Its military was stretched thin across multiple theaters. The invasion of Sicily had been a British idea, but it had been executed with American resources and ultimately won by an American general. Churchill understood all of this. He saw the future with perfect clarity. Britain would win the war, but it would lose the peace. The British Empire that Churchill loved would be dismantled within a generation. The special relationship between Britain and America would be a relationship of junior partner to senior partner, not equals. Everything Churchill had worked for his entire life, the preservation of British power and prestige, was slipping away. And George Patton, with his loud mouth and his fast tanks and his victory at Messina, was a symbol of everything Churchill feared. Patton represented the new American century that was about to dawn. He represented a style of warfare that was aggressive, impatient, and ultimately more effective than the careful British approach. He represented a country that had more resources, more energy, and more ambition than exhausted old Britain could ever match. When Churchill made his cutting remarks about Patton's hollow victory at Messina, he wasn't just commenting on a military operation. He was expressing grief for a dying empire and resentment toward its replacement. The news of Churchill's comments eventually made its way back to American commanders. And let me tell you, they were not happy. General George Marshall, the American Army Chief of Staff and one of the most respected officers in the entire military, was particularly offended. Marshall had spent years building up American military power and fighting for American leadership in the alliance. He viewed Churchill's comments as proof that the British would never respect American contributions, no matter how significant. Marshall's response was to push even harder for American command of major operations. At the Quebec Conference and in subsequent planning sessions, Marshall insisted that the cross-channel invasion, when it finally came, must be commanded by an American general. He argued that Sicily had shown what happened when British commanders were in charge: dysfunction, rivalry, and strategic failure. The only way to ensure Allied success was to put Americans in command and keep them there. This was a direct challenge to British prestige and power. For 3 years, British officers had commanded major Allied operations. British generals had made the big decisions. British strategy had shaped the war. Marshall was proposing to end all of that and put America in the driver's seat permanently. Churchill resisted this for as long as he could. He proposed various compromise arrangements that would preserve British influence. He argued that British experience should count for something. He reminded the Americans that Britain had been fighting this war while America was still neutral. But in the end, Churchill had to accept reality. America was the dominant partner. American generals would command the invasion of France. American strategy would shape the final years of the war. The race to Messina, and Churchill's bitter response to it, marked a turning point in the Anglo-American alliance. The impact of Churchill's comments extended beyond high-level strategy. At the operational level, relations between American and British commanders deteriorated significantly after Sicily. Patton, who had always been suspicious of the British, became actively hostile. He refused to coordinate with Montgomery in future operations. He complained constantly about British arrogance and incompetence. He told anyone who would listen that the British were trying to claim credit for American victories and shift blame for British failures. Montgomery was just as bad, maybe worse. He dismissed American tactical abilities. He criticized American planning. So Churchill made cutting remarks about Patton's hollow victory, shifted blame wherever he could, and continued advocating for his Mediterranean strategy even as the evidence mounted against it. He was a brilliant man trapped by his own earlier decisions, watching his country's influence fade while putting on a brave face for the world. The aftermath of Sicily would shape the rest of the war in Europe. The cross-Channel invasion, D-Day, finally happened in June 1944, almost exactly a year after the Sicily campaign. It was commanded by an American general, Dwight Eisenhower, just as Marshall had insisted. British forces played a crucial role, but they were clearly the junior partner. American troops outnumbered British troops. American equipment dominated the battlefield. American logistics kept the whole operation running. Montgomery got command of the ground forces for the initial invasion, but even that was temporary. Within months, he was subordinated to American command, a situation he resented bitterly until the day he died. Churchill remained involved in strategic decisions, but his influence was diminished. When he proposed Mediterranean adventures or Balkan operations, the Americans politely listened and then did what they wanted anyway. The special relationship continued, but it was no longer a relationship of equals. And what about Patton? The hero of Messina? The general who had proven American soldiers could outfight anyone. Well, Patton's story took a dark turn almost immediately after his triumph. Just days after entering Messina, Patton visited a military hospital in Sicily. There he encountered soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, what we would now call PTSD. Patton, who believed that cowardice was the only explanation for mental breakdown, slapped two soldiers and called them cowards. One he threatened to shoot on the spot. The slapping incidents became a major scandal. Eisenhower had to decide whether to send Patton home in disgrace or keep him in the theater. He chose to keep Patton, but Patton was sidelined for months. He missed the invasion of Italy. He missed major battles. He sat in Sicily and then in England, watching other generals get the glory while he waited for a second chance. Churchill, when he heard about the slapping incidents, reportedly made another cutting remark. He said something like, "The Americans have finally found a way to punish Patton for winning at Messina. Make him watch while others fight." It was another example of Churchill's dark humor, another cutting observation wrapped in wit. Unlike his earlier remarks, it contained a kernel of uncomfortable truth. Patton had won the race to Messina, but the victory had cost him more than it had gained. His recklessness, his ego, his inability to control himself had all been exposed. He would get another chance, eventually, leading the Third Army in the breakout from Normandy. But he would never fully escape the shadow of Sicily.